The security guard's face went pale when he saw my name on the ownership papers. "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell," he stammered, looking between the documents and my wrinkled face. You own Sunset Manor now?" I smiled sweetly, the same smile I'd given my 3 ungrateful children for 78 years. "That's right, dear. And as the new owner, I'm implementing some immediate policy changes. Visiting hours for the Hartwell family are now permanently suspended." Behind him, I could see my son Robert and daughters Patricia and Linda walking up the front steps, carrying their usual gilt flowers and fake smiles, ready for their weekly 15-minute visit. They had no idea what was coming. Comment below, as I'd love to hear your thought, and subscribe to the channel to help us hit that big 5,000 subscriber milestone. We're so close, and every single one counts. It's free for you, but it means everything to this channel. And hey, while you're at it, I've left a video and also a link to a playlist on the final screen that I promise will surprise you. Seriously, don't miss them. Thanks so much for watching all the way through. Now go hit that button and be part of the journey. Let me tell you how I got to this point. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and 6 months ago, I thought my children loved me. I was so wrong about so many things, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This story really begins on a cold Tuesday morning in March, when everything in my life changed forever. I had been living in my beautiful 4-bedroom house on Maple Street for 45 years. It was the house where I raised Robert, Patricia, and Linda after their father passed away when they were just teenagers. I worked 2 jobs to keep that house, scrubbing floors at the hospital by night and working at the grocery store during the day. Every penny went into making sure my children had everything they needed. College funds, nice clothes, family vacations. I gave them everything, even when it meant I went without. The house held so many memories. The kitchen where I taught Patricia how to bake her first cake. The living room where Robert practiced his saxophone for school band. The backyard where Linda had her sweet 16 party. Every corner of that house was filled with love and sacrifice. But lately, maintaining it had become harder. My arthritis made cleaning difficult, and the stairs to the 2nd floor felt like climbing a mountain some days. That's when my children started their campaign. It began innocently enough. Little comments here and there about how big the house was for just one person. "Mom, wouldn't you be happier somewhere with people your own age?" Patricia would say during her monthly visits. "You could make friends, play bingo, have activities," Linda would add, as if I was some lonely old woman who needed constant entertainment. But I wasn't ready to give up my independence. I had my garden, my neighborhood friends, and most importantly, my dignity. I could still take care of myself, thank you very much. Sure, I moved a little slower, and yes, I sometimes forgot where I put my glasses. But I was far from helpless. The pressure increased over the following months. Robert, who was a lawyer and thought he knew everything, started bringing pamphlets about active senior living communities. He'd spread them across my kitchen table like he was presenting evidence in court. "Look at these amenities, Mom. They have a pool, organized trips, medical staff on site. It's like living in a resort." What he didn't say, but what I heard loud and clear, was that they wanted me gone. They wanted my house. Robert had always admired the property, mentioning how much it would be worth if it was properly developed. Patricia lived in a tiny apartment with her husband and 3 kids, constantly complaining about space. And Linda, well, Linda had expensive taste and a gambling problem she thought I didn't know about. The final straw came on a rainy Thursday in September. I had fallen in my bathroom and couldn't get up for about 20 minutes. My hip was sore, but I was fine. I managed to pull myself up using the towel rack and continued with my day. But somehow Robert found out. I suspect my nosy neighbor, Mrs. Peterson called him after she saw the ambulance drive by, even though it wasn't for me. That evening, all 3 of my children showed up at my door. Not together, mind you. They never did anything together unless it benefited them. Robert arrived first, his face stern and determined. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into my living room like he owned the place. Within an hour, Patricia and Linda had arrived too. They sat on my couch, the same couch where I used to read them bedtime stories, and delivered what felt like a rehearsed speech about my declining safety and their deep concern for my well-being. "We've found the perfect place for you, Mom," Patricia said, pulling out a glossy brochure. "Sunset Manor is the best nursing home in the county. They have excellent reviews, and it's only 20 minutes away from all of us." Nursing home. The words hit me like a slap across the face. Not assisted living, not a senior community, a nursing home. The kind of place where people go to wait to die. "I don't need a nursing home, I said firmly. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." That's when Linda spoke up, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Mom, you fell today. What if next time you break something? What if no one finds you for days? We worry about you all the time." The manipulation was so obvious, it made me sick. They worried about me. Then why did I see them maybe once a month each? Why did they never call just to chat? Why did every conversation eventually turn to money or what I was going to do with the house? But the worst part was what came next. Robert cleared his throat and pulled out some papers. "We've already spoken to the social worker at Sunset Manor. With your recent fall and your age, we can have you admitted under a safety concern evaluation. It's for your own good, Mom." I stared at him in shock. They had already made arrangements. Behind my back, my own children had planned to have me committed to a nursing home like I was some kind of invalid who couldn't make my own decisions. "This is my house," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "I'm not going anywhere." Patricia reached over and patted my hand like I was a child having a tantrum. "Mom, you don't really have a choice. We've consulted with lawyers, and given your recent incidents and your age, the court will side with us if we need to pursue guardianship. It's better if you come willingly." Guardianship? They were threatening to take away my legal rights as an adult human being. My own children were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could control my life, and more importantly, my assets. The next 2 weeks were a blur of legal threats, emotional manipulation, and outright bullying. They tag-teamed me, never leaving me alone. Someone was always at my house, helping me pack, organizing my affairs, and making sure I didn't change my mind about what was best for me. I tried to fight them. I called 3 different lawyers, but Robert had already been to see them, spinning his story about his poor, confused mother, who was becoming a danger to herself. One lawyer actually suggested I might want to consider their offer before they pursued legal guardianship, which would be much more unpleasant for everyone involved. I felt trapped, betrayed, and completely alone. The 3 people I had sacrificed everything for, the children I had loved more than life itself, were systematically destroying what remained of my independence and dignity. The day they came to take me to Sunset Manor was the worst day of my life. Worse than when my husband died, because at least then I had my children to comfort me. Now, my children were the ones causing my pain. I packed 1 small suitcase, as they had instructed. "You don't need much, Mom," Linda had said. "They provide everything there. Besides, we need to start clearing out the house anyway." Of course they did. Before I was even gone, they were already planning how to divide up my life. The ride to Sunset Manor was silent, except for Patricia's attempts at cheerful small talk about how I was going to love it there and make so many new friends. I stared out the window, watching my neighborhood disappear, wondering if I would ever see my home again. Sunset Manor was exactly what you'd expect from a nursing home trying too hard to look cheerful. Beige walls covered with fake flower paintings, the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with something I didn't want to identify, and elderly residents shuffling around in wheelchairs and walkers, looking like they had given up on life entirely. The staff was friendly enough, I suppose. They showed me to my room, a space about half the size of my walk-in closet at home, and explained the meal schedule, activity times, and visiting hours. Visiting hours were 24/7 for family members, they said with a smile, as if this was some great privilege. My children stayed for exactly 30 minutes that first day. Long enough to make sure I was settled in and to sign a few papers. Robert handled the business side, of course, while Patricia and Linda made cooing noises about how nice my room was and how the staff seemed so caring. "We'll visit every week, Mom," Robert promised as they prepared to leave. "This is going to be great for you. You'll see." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in a sterile room that smelled like sadness and defeat, surrounded by strangers, with nothing left of the life I had built for myself over nearly 8 decades. That first night, I lay in the narrow hospital bed and listened to my new roommate, a woman named Dorothy, mumble in her sleep about her children who never visited. I thought about my beautiful house sitting empty on Maple Street, probably already being measured and evaluated by real estate agents. I thought about my garden, which would die without care. I thought about my independence, my dignity, and my rights as a human being, all taken away by the people who were supposed to love me most. But mostly, I thought about revenge. The next morning brought my first real shock at Sunset Manor. During breakfast in the dining room, if you could call the watery scrambled eggs and burnt toast breakfast, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. 2 nurses were discussing the facility's financial troubles, not realizing I was listening. "The owners are getting desperate," one nurse whispered to another. "Occupancy is down, and they're behind on loan payments. Word is they're looking for a buyer, but who wants to take on a struggling nursing home?" I nearly choked on my orange juice. Sunset Manor was for sale. The very place where my children had imprisoned me was in financial trouble and looking for new ownership. For the first time since arriving, I smiled a real smile. That afternoon, during what they called rest time, I made a phone call that would change everything. I called my old friend Margaret, who had worked as a financial advisor before retiring. Margaret had helped me manage my investments over the years. Investments my children knew nothing about because they had never bothered to ask about my finances beyond the value of my house. "Eleanor, honey, what can I do for you?" Margaret's warm voice made me want to cry with relief. Finally, someone who treated me like a person instead of a burden. "Margaret, I need your help with something unusual," I said, keeping my voice low. "I need to know if I have enough money to buy a nursing home." There was a pause. "Buy a nursing home? Eleanor, what's going on?" I explained everything. The manipulation, the threats, the way my children had forced me into this place against my will. Margaret listened with increasing outrage. "Those ungrateful little—" she started, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know they're your children, but this is unconscionable." We spent the next hour going over my financial situation. What my children didn't know was that I had been a very smart investor over the years. The life insurance money from my husband's death, the savings from my years of working multiple jobs, the careful investments Margaret had helped me make. It had all grown substantially over the decades. I wasn't just comfortable. I was wealthy. Wealthy enough, as it turned out, to buy Sunset Manor outright. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor?" Margaret asked. "It's a big step." I thought about my children's fake smiles and guilt flowers. I thought about how they had threatened to have me declared incompetent. I thought about how they planned to sell my house and divide the proceeds while I rotted away in this place, forgotten and powerless. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. The next few weeks were the most exciting I'd had in years. Margaret worked as my agent, negotiating with the current owners of Sunset Manor, while I played the role of a docile, defeated old lady. The staff had no idea that the quiet woman in room 237B was orchestrating the purchase of their entire facility. The current owners were indeed desperate. They had overextended themselves financially and were facing bankruptcy. My offer, cash, full asking price, quick closing, was like an answer to their prayers. Within a month, I owned Sunset Manor completely. But I didn't tell anyone yet. Not the staff, not my fellow residents, and certainly not my children. I wanted to savor this moment, to plan my revenge carefully. After all, what's the point of sweet revenge if you rush it? My children continued their weekly visits, 15 minutes each, like clockwork. They would arrive separately, never together, because that might require actual coordination or effort. Robert on Tuesdays, Patricia on Thursdays, Linda on Saturdays. Each visit followed the same pattern: guilt flowers, 5 minutes of fake conversation about how I was adjusting, and then relief when they could leave and check "visited mom" off their weekly to-do list. During one particularly insulting visit, Robert actually had the nerve to update me on what they were doing with my house. "We've decided to sell it, Mom," he said, as if I had any say in the matter. "The real estate market is really good right now, and the money will help secure your care here for years to come." Secure my care. As if they were doing me a favor by selling my home and keeping the proceeds. I smiled sweetly and nodded, letting him think I was too defeated to fight back. "That sounds very sensible, dear," I said. "You children know best." If only he knew that I now owned the very building he was standing in, and that I was about to teach him and his sisters a lesson they would never forget. The day finally came when I was ready to reveal my secret. I had spent weeks planning this moment, making sure every detail was perfect. I scheduled a meeting with the facility administrator, ostensibly to discuss my concerns about the care I was receiving. What the staff didn't know was that they were about to meet their new boss. But as I sat in that administrator's office, holding the ownership papers that would change everything, I heard familiar voices in the lobby. My children had arrived for their weekly visits, and they were about to walk into the biggest surprise of their lives. I quickly tucked the ownership papers into my purse as footsteps echoed down the hallway. Through the administrator's office window, I could see Robert straightening his tie. The same nervous habit he'd had since childhood, whenever he was about to do something he knew was wrong. Patricia was fussing with her hair, and Linda was checking her phone, probably calculating how quickly she could escape after this obligatory visit. The administrator, Mr. Thompson, was still reviewing what he thought were my care concerns, completely unaware that he was actually looking at a formal notice of ownership transfer. "Mrs. Hartwell, I assure you we take all resident feedback very seriously," he was saying when his secretary knocked on the door. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson, but Mrs. Hartwell's children are here for their visit. Should I tell them she's in a meeting?" This was perfect, better than I had planned. "Oh, no," I said sweetly, standing up slowly with my cane for effect. "I wouldn't want to keep my loving children waiting. Mr. Thompson, perhaps we could continue our discussion later this afternoon, say around 2 o'clock. He nodded, still focused on the papers. "Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. I'll have some recommendations ready for you by then." If only he knew that by 2 o'clock I would be giving him recommendations as his new employer. I made my way to the lobby, my heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment I had been planning for weeks. My children stood near the reception desk, the picture of reluctant duty. Robert was already checking his watch. Patricia had that fake smile plastered on her face. And Linda looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Hello, Mother," Robert said, stepping forward with a small bouquet of grocery store flowers. The same cheap daisies he brought every week, probably picked up at the gas station on his way over. "Robert, dear," I replied, accepting his stiff, obligatory hug. "And Patricia, Linda, how wonderful to see you all." Patricia's hug was even more perfunctory than Robert's. "How are you feeling today, Mom? You look settled." Settled. As if I was a piece of furniture they had successfully stored away. "Oh, I'm doing wonderfully," I said, my voice bright with genuine happiness for the first time in months. "In fact, I have some very exciting news to share with you all." Linda perked up slightly. In her mind, exciting news from an elderly woman in a nursing home probably meant I was finally ready to discuss my will or sign over more assets to them. "What kind of news, Mom?" she asked, and I could practically see dollar signs in her eyes. "Well," I said, settling into one of the lobby chairs and gesturing for them to sit, "I've been thinking a lot about our family lately, about everything you've done for me." They exchanged glances. Robert's lawyer instincts were kicking in. He could sense something was different, but he couldn't put his finger on what. That's nice, Mom," Patricia said carefully. "We've only done what any loving children would do." I nodded slowly. "Yes, exactly. You've shown me exactly what kind of children you are, and I want you to know how grateful I am for that clarity." The confusion on their faces was delicious. They were expecting the usual defeated, grateful mother routine. Instead, I was sitting up straight, my eyes clear and focused, speaking with a confidence they hadn't heard from me in months. "I've learned so much since coming here," I continued, "about family, about loyalty, about what really matters in life. And I've made some decisions that I think will surprise you." Robert leaned forward. "What kind of decisions, Mom?" "Well, for starters, I've decided to take a more active role in my living situation here at Sunset Manor." Linda laughed, a sharp sound that echoed through the lobby. "Mom, you don't have any role in your living situation. You're a resident. The staff takes care of everything." I smiled at her condescending tone. "Oh, Linda, you're absolutely right. The staff does take care of everything." Which is why I thought it was so important to get to know them better. Did you know that Sunset Manor has been struggling financially? The previous owners were facing bankruptcy. Patricia frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Well, I was concerned about the stability of my care, of course. What would happen to all of us residents if the facility closed? Where would we go?" It was very worrying. Robert's legal mind was working now. "Mom, if there were financial issues with this place, we would have been notified. We're your family. We're involved in your care decisions." "Are you?" I asked innocently. "Because I don't recall any of you asking about the facility's financial health. When you had me committed here, you just wanted me out of my house as quickly as possible." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My children shifted uncomfortably, clearly not liking this new assertive version of their mother. "Mom," Patricia said carefully, "we didn't have you committed anywhere. We helped you make the best decision for your safety and well-being." "By threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't comply?" The words hung in the air like an accusation because that's exactly what they were. Robert cleared his throat. "Mom, I think you're remembering things differently than they happened. We were concerned about your fall. You're living alone in that big house." "My house that you're selling without my permission?" Another uncomfortable silence. They really hadn't expected me to fight back, had they? For months, I had played the role of the defeated, grateful mother. Now they were seeing the woman who had worked 2 jobs to raise them, who had fought for everything we had, who had never backed down from a challenge in her life. "The house sale is in your best interest," Robert said finally. "The proceeds will ensure your care here for many years to come." "How generous of you to secure my imprisonment with my own money." Linda stood up abruptly. "I don't like your tone, Mom. We've done nothing but try to help you, and now you're acting like we're the villains here." "Aren't you?" The question was simple, direct, and completely without my usual diplomatic softness. Linda looked genuinely shocked that I would dare to challenge them so directly. "We're your children," she said, as if that automatically made everything they had done acceptable. "Yes, you are. And as my children, you threatened me, manipulated me, and forced me into this place against my will so you could steal my house and divide up my assets. Tell me, Linda, what part of that sounds like love to you?" Patricia jumped in, trying to salvage the situation. "Mom, you're being dramatic. This is a nice place, you're getting good care, and we visit you every week." 15 minutes, I said flatly. "You each visit for exactly 15 minutes once a week. Just long enough to ease your consciences, but not long enough to actually spend time with me." Robert was getting frustrated now. I could see it in the way his jaw was tightening. The same expression he used to get as a child when he was caught in a lie. "Fine," he said. "You want honesty? Here's honesty. You were becoming a liability, Mom. Living alone, falling, probably forgetting to take your medications or pay bills. We couldn't constantly worry about what might happen to you. So you solved your worry problem by getting rid of me." "We solved a practical problem with a practical solution," he snapped. "And frankly, I don't appreciate this guilt trip. We've done our duty as your children." Duty. Not love, not care, not concern. Duty. As if I was some obligation they had to fulfill, rather than the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise them. "Your duty," I repeated slowly. "How interesting that you see caring for the woman who gave you life as a duty rather than a privilege." Linda sat back down, her patience clearly exhausted. "What do you want from us, Mom? We can't change what's already done. You're here, you're safe, you're cared for. Isn't that enough?" "What I want," I said, standing up and gripping my cane, "is for you to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people the way you've treated me and expect there to be no price to pay." They were all staring at me now, and I could see the first flickers of real concern in their eyes. Not concern for my well-being, but concern about what I might do to disrupt their carefully laid plans. "What are you talking about?" Robert asked slowly. "I'm talking about the fact that underestimating someone is always a mistake, especially when that someone is your mother." I turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back at them. "Oh, by the way, I'm expecting some very important visitors this afternoon. Business associates, you might say. You're welcome to stay if you'd like to meet them." "What business associates?" Patricia called after me, but I was already walking toward the elevator, my cane tapping a steady rhythm on the polished floor. Behind me, I could hear them whispering urgently among themselves, trying to figure out what I was up to. They had no idea that in just a few hours, their entire world was about to turn upside down. I spent the rest of the morning in my room, preparing for the 2 o'clock meeting. Margaret arrived early, along with the lawyer she had recommended, a sharp woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in business acquisitions. We met in the facility's conference room, which would soon be my conference room. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Eleanor?" Margaret asked one more time. "Once we make this public, there's no going back." I thought about my children's faces in the lobby, their casual dismissal of my feelings, their assumption that I would simply accept whatever they decided was best for me. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I said firmly. At exactly 2 o'clock, Mr. Thompson arrived for what he thought was a follow-up meeting about my care concerns. He looked confused when he saw Margaret and Sarah sitting at the table. "Mrs. D. Hartwell, I thought this was going to be a private meeting about your concerns." "It is," I said. "Please, sit down." He took a seat across from us, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure I understand what's happening here." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Sarah Chen, and I'm representing Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell." In a business transaction, as of this morning, Mrs. Hartwell is the new owner of Sunset Manor." The color drained from Thompson's face. He looked at me, then at the documents Sarah was spreading across the table, then back at me. I don't understand. Mrs. Hartwell is a resident here. She can't. How did she? "I bought it," I said simply. "Cash purchase, completed this morning. Congratulations, Mr. Thompson, you now work for me." He sat in stunned silence for a full minute, processing this information. Finally, he found his voice. "Mrs. Hartwell, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. There are protocols, regulations about nursing home ownership. The state will need to review, all of which have been properly filed," Sarah interrupted smoothly. "Mrs. Hartwell's ownership of this facility is completely legal and properly documented. She meets all financial requirements and has no legal restrictions that would prevent her from owning and operating a care facility." But you're a resident," Thompson sputtered. "I was a resident," I corrected. "Now I'm the owner. And as the owner, I have some immediate policy changes I'd like to implement." Sarah handed him a prepared document. "These are Mrs. Hartwell's initial directives as the new owner. Please review them carefully." Thompson's hands were shaking slightly as he read through the list. Most of the changes were standard operational improvements: better food, more activities for residents, increased staff training. But at the bottom of the page, his eyes widened. "Restricted visiting list," he read aloud. "Visiting privileges for Robert Hartwell, Patricia Morrison, and Linda Jackson are hereby permanently revoked?" "That's correct," I said calmly. "Those individuals are no longer welcome on the premises." "Mrs. Hartwell, these are your children. I can't ban your own family from visiting you." "You're not banning them," I explained. "I am. As the owner of this facility, I have the right to determine who is and isn't welcome here. And as a resident, I have the right to determine who I do and don't want to see." Thompson looked desperately at Margaret and Sarah, hoping one of them would explain that this was all some kind of elaborate joke. "This is legally sound," Sarah assured him. "Private facilities have the right to refuse entry to individuals for various reasons, including at the request of residents, when there are concerns about harassment or emotional abuse." "Emotional abuse?" Thompson repeated weakly. "Forcing an elderly person into institutional care against their will, threatening them with legal action, manipulating them through fear tactics. Yes, Mr. Thompson, that constitutes emotional abuse." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, still staring at the documents. When he finally looked up at me, there was something different in his expression, something that might have been respect. "Mrs. Hartwell, may I ask why you didn't reveal your capabilities when you first arrived here?" I smiled at him. "Because sometimes the best way to learn about a situation is to experience it from the bottom up. I wanted to understand what life was really like here for the residents, what problems needed to be solved, what improvements needed to be made." "And your children have no idea about any of this?" "None whatsoever. They think I'm just a helpless old woman who should be grateful for their 15-minute weekly visits." Thompson actually smiled at that. "I have to admit, Mrs. Hartwell, this is the most interesting ownership transition I've ever been part of." "Oh, Mr. Thompson," I said, standing up and gathering my papers. "The interesting part hasn't even started yet." As if summoned by my words, there was a commotion in the lobby. Through the conference room windows, we could see my 3 children arguing with the receptionist. They had returned, probably hoping to figure out what I had been up to during my mysterious meeting. "Perfect timing," I murmured. "Mr. Thompson, would you mind asking security to escort those 3 individuals off the premises? They're no longer welcome here." Thompson looked at me for a long moment, then picked up the phone. "Security to the main lobby, please. We have some visitors who need to be removed from the building." Through the window, I watched as the security guards approached my children. I could see Robert's face turning red as he argued, probably trying to use his lawyer voice to intimidate them. Patricia looked confused and upset. Linda appeared to be having some kind of breakdown. But the best part was when the security guard, the same one who would later see my ownership papers, pointed toward the conference room where I was standing. All three of my children turned to look, and I gave them a little wave. The expressions on their faces were everything I had hoped for, and more. The look of absolute shock on Robert's face when he saw me waving from the conference room window was worth every penny I had spent to buy Sunset Manor. His mouth was actually hanging open, and for the first time in his adult life, my lawyer son appeared to be completely speechless. Patricia was pointing at me frantically, trying to explain something to the security guard, while Linda had gone pale and was gripping the reception desk like she might faint. I watched through the glass as the scene unfolded in the lobby. The security guard was politely but firmly explaining that they needed to leave the premises immediately. Robert was pulling out his phone, probably trying to call someone who could fix this impossible situation. Patricia was crying now, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks, and Linda was shouting something I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mr. Thompson said softly, "are you sure about this? They are your children." I turned away from the window to face him. "Mr. Thompson, when someone shows you who they really are, believe them. My children showed me exactly who they are when they forced me into this place. Now I'm showing them exactly who I am." Through the glass, I could see Robert trying to push past the security guard, his face red with anger and frustration. The guard was having none of it, placing a firm hand on Robert's chest and shaking his head. Patricia was now pleading with the receptionist, her hands clasped together like she was praying. "Should I go talk to them?" Margaret asked gently. "Maybe explain the situation?" "There's nothing to explain," I replied. "They made their choice when they decided I was a burden to be disposed of. Now they get to live with the consequences of that choice." Sarah was packing up her legal documents with an expression of professional satisfaction. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to say, in 20 years of practicing law, this is one of the most satisfying cases I've ever handled." The commotion in the lobby was escalating. I could see other residents gathering to watch the drama unfold, some in wheelchairs, others with walkers, all looking more entertained than they had probably been in months. Dorothy from my room was there, pointing and whispering to her friend, Mrs. Garcia. Finally, the security guards managed to escort all three of my children toward the exit. But just before they reached the doors, Robert broke free and ran back toward the conference room. He pressed his face against the window, his eyes wild with desperation and rage. "Mom!" he shouted, loud enough that I could hear him through the glass. "You can't do this! This is insane! You're not thinking clearly!" I walked slowly to the window and placed my hand against the glass, separated from my son by just a few inches and a lifetime of broken trust. When I spoke, my voice was calm and clear. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, Robert." His face contorted with frustration. "This is financial elder abuse. You're being manipulated by these people." He gestured wildly at Margaret and Sarah. "I'm going to have this reversed. I'm going to get guardianship and—" I smiled at him. "You're going to try to have me declared incompetent again? The same threat you used to force me here in the first place?" The security guards caught up with Robert and took him firmly by the arms. As they dragged him away, he kept shouting threats and promises that he would fix this, that I couldn't get away with this, that I didn't understand what I was doing. But I understood perfectly. For the first time in months, I understood everything with crystal clarity. Patricia and Linda were waiting by the front doors, both crying now. As Robert was escorted outside, Patricia ran up to the window one more time. "Mom, please," she sobbed. "We're your family. We love you. We were just trying to take care of you." The words might have meant something 6 months ago. Before the threats, before the manipulation, before they had stolen my home and my freedom. But now they just sounded hollow and desperate. I watched as the three people I had once loved more than life itself were escorted off the property and told never to return. They stood in the parking lot for a long time, arguing among themselves, pointing at the building, making phone calls. I could imagine the conversations between Robert trying to find a legal way to undo what had happened, Patricia calling other family members for support, Linda probably trying to figure out how this affected her gambling debts. Eventually, they got in their separate cars and drove away, leaving me standing in the conference room with a sense of peace I hadn't felt since this whole nightmare began. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, putting a gentle hand on my shoulder. I considered the question carefully. "Powerful," I said finally. "For the first time in months, I feel like I have power over my own life." Mr. Thompson was looking at me with something that might have been admiration. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to ask, what made you think of buying the facility?" I smiled at the memory. It was actually something one of the nurses said about the financial troubles here. That's when I realized that the place where my children had trapped me might actually be the key to my freedom. "And you had the resources to make such a purchase?" "My children never bothered to ask about my finances beyond the value of my house," I explained. "They assumed I was just a poor old widow living on Social Security. They had no idea about my investments, my savings, or my husband's life insurance policy. They saw what they wanted to see, a helpless old woman they could manipulate." Sarah finished packing her briefcase and stood to leave. "Mrs. Hartwell, the legal paperwork is all complete. You're now officially the owner of Sunset Manor. If your children try to challenge this purchase, they'll find it's completely legitimate and legally sound." "What about the guardianship threats?" I asked. Robert mentioned trying to get that reversed. "He can try," Sarah said with a slight smile, "but it's going to be very difficult to argue that someone is mentally incompetent when they've just successfully negotiated and completed a major business acquisition. Your purchase of this facility actually works in your favor if there are any future legal challenges." After Margaret and Sarah left, I spent the rest of the afternoon getting to know my new role as facility owner. Mr. Thompson gave me a complete tour, showing me areas I had never seen as a resident. The administrative offices, the staff break rooms, the kitchen facilities, the maintenance areas. "The previous owners weren't bad people," Thompson explained as we walked through the building. "They just got in over their heads, financially. They expanded too quickly, took on too much debt, and when occupancy dropped, they couldn't keep up with the payments." I made notes as we toured, already planning improvements. The residents' dining room needed better lighting and more comfortable chairs. The activity room was sadly understocked and uninspiring. The staff looked overworked and underpaid. "Mr. Thompson," I said, as we concluded the tour, "I want to call a staff meeting for tomorrow morning. Nothing dramatic, just an introduction and a chance to discuss some changes I'd like to implement." "What kind of changes?" "Better food, more activities, improved facilities, and a raise for every staff member who's been here more than 6 months." His eyebrows went up. "A raise?" "Mrs. Hartwell, I should warn you, this facility operates on very thin margins. The previous owners were cutting costs wherever possible just to stay afloat." "Then it's a good thing I'm not operating on thin margins," I replied. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't buy this place to make money. I bought it to make a point. And part of that point is showing that elderly care can be done properly when profit isn't the only motive." That evening, I had dinner in the residents' dining room as usual, but everything felt different. The other residents had heard about the drama in the lobby, and word was spreading that something major had happened involving me and my family. Mrs. Dorothy leaned over during dessert, if you could call the watery pudding dessert. "Eleanor, dear, is it true that you bought this place?" I looked around the dining room at the faces of my fellow residents. These were people who, like me, had been written off by their families. warehoused in a place that was supposed to care for them, but mostly just kept them alive. They deserved better. Yes, Dorothy, it's true. The dining room went quiet. 23 elderly faces stared at me with expressions ranging from disbelief to hope. Does that mean, asked Mr. Peterson from the corner table, that you can do something about the food? I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. Mr. Peterson, improving the food is first on my list. A cheer went up from the residents, weak and creaky voices raised in the celebration. For the first time since arriving at Sunset Manor, the dining room was filled with something that had been missing: hope. But my satisfaction was short-lived. As I was preparing for bed that evening, there was a knock on my door. A staff member I didn't recognize, a young man in a maintenance uniform, peered into my room. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry to bother you, but there are some people outside who are asking to see you. They say they're your family, and they're pretty upset. I walked to my window and looked down at the parking lot. There they were, Robert's luxury sedan, Patricia's minivan, and Linda's compact car. My children had returned, and this time they had brought reinforcements. I could see Robert's wife Susan, Patricia's husband David, and what looked like Linda's teenage daughter Emma. They were standing in a circle in the parking lot, clearly planning something. Robert was gesturing animatedly, probably explaining his legal strategy. Patricia was dabbing at her eyes with tissues. Linda was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. As I watched, Robert pulled out his phone and made a call. A few minutes later, another car pulled into the parking lot. A police car. My heart sank a little. They were escalating this, bringing in law enforcement to try to force their way back into the facility. Robert was probably telling the police that his elderly mother was being held against her will, or that she was being taken advantage of by con artists. But then I remembered Sarah's words. My purchase of Sunset Manor actually proved my mental competence. And I remembered something else. I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't trapped in my children's web of manipulation and control. I owned this building, and I had rights. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Thompson. There are some people in the parking lot with a police officer, I told him. They're going to try to convince the officer that I'm being held here against my will, or that I've been manipulated into making bad decisions. I want you to be present for any conversation that takes place. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. Should I call our facility's legal counsel as well? No, I said firmly. I can handle my own children. 20 minutes later, there was another knock on my door. Mr. Thompson entered, followed by a police officer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mrs. Hartwell, the officer said politely, I'm Officer Martinez. Your son called us with some concerns about your welfare. He says you may be under some kind of duress or influence from people who are trying to take advantage of you financially. I smiled at Officer Martinez. He seemed like a decent man who was just trying to do his job in a complicated situation. Officer Martinez, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that I am not under any duress. I am of sound mind and body, and I have made some business decisions that my children don't approve of. Your son mentioned that you recently purchased this nursing home facility. He seems to think this might not have been a decision you made freely. I walked to my dresser and pulled out the folder of legal documents Sarah had left with me. Officer Martinez, here is all the paperwork related to my purchase of Sunset Manor. As you can see, I was represented by legal counsel. The transaction was completed through proper channels, and I met all financial and legal requirements. Officer Martinez looked through the documents, his expression growing more relaxed as he realized this wasn't the case of elder abuse he had been expecting. Mrs. Hartwell, these documents appear to be in order. You clearly have legal representation and the financial means to make this purchase. But your family seems very concerned about your decision. My family is concerned about losing access to my assets, I corrected. They forced me into this facility against my will, so they could sell my house and control my finances. When I turned the tables on them, they became upset. The officer nodded slowly. And you made the decision to restrict their visiting privileges? I did. They have spent months manipulating and threatening me. I no longer wish to have contact with them. Officer Martinez closed the folder and handed it back to me. Ma'am, you clearly have the legal right to make these decisions. However, your family is very upset, and they're asking if they can speak with you, just for a few minutes. I thought about it. Part of me was curious to hear what they had to say, now that the power dynamic had completely shifted. Another part of me wanted to savor their desperation a little longer. Tell them they can each write me a letter, I said finally. If they want to communicate with me, they can put their thoughts in writing, but I will not see them in person. Officer Martinez nodded and prepared to leave, but then he paused at the door. Mrs. Hartwell, can I ask you something? How does it feel to turn the tables on people who thought they had all the power? I smiled at him. Officer Martinez, it feels like justice. After he left, I returned to my window to watch the scene in the parking lot. I could see Officer Martinez talking to my children, probably explaining that I was competent, that the purchase was legal, and that I had every right to restrict their access. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Robert threw his hands up in the air and started shouting at the officer, at his wife, at his sisters. Patricia collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing dramatically. Linda actually kicked the tire of her car in frustration. But the best part came when Officer Martinez got back in his patrol car and drove away, leaving my children standing alone in the parking lot with no legal recourse and no way to force their way back into my life. They stood there for almost an hour, arguing and planning and trying to figure out their next move. But eventually, one by one, they got in their cars and left. As I watched Linda's taillights disappear into the night, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. This was just the beginning of their consequences, but it was a good start. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, I was sure. Robert would probably spend all night researching ways to challenge my purchase. Patricia would likely call every relative she could think of to try to build support for their cause. Linda would probably have some kind of breakdown. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was going to sleep peacefully in my narrow nursing home bed, knowing that I had taken back control of my life in the most spectacular way possible. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of what tomorrow would bring, because if my children thought this was over, they had seriously underestimated the woman who had raised them, the woman who had just proven that sometimes the best revenge is living well and owning the building where you're living. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my phone ringing at 6:30 a.m. The caller ID showed Robert's number, and I let it go to voicemail. Then Patricia called. Then Linda. Then Robert again. By 7 o'clock, I had 12 missed calls and my voicemail was full. I didn't bother listening to the messages. I knew exactly what they would say. Threats, pleas, accusations, and probably more threats. Instead, I got dressed and made my way to the dining room for breakfast, where I was greeted by something I had never seen before at Sunset Manor: actual food. Mrs. Hartwell, said Maria, one of the kitchen staff, as she set a plate in front of me. Mr. Thompson told us about the menu changes you approved: fresh eggs, real bacon, homemade biscuits, and fruit that was actually picked this week. I took a bite of the scrambled eggs and nearly cried. They were fluffy, seasoned properly, and served hot. The bacon was crispy, the biscuits were buttery, and the strawberries were sweet and fresh. Maria, this is wonderful. How did you manage to change everything so quickly? She smiled proudly. We've been wanting to cook real food for years, but the old owners said it was too expensive. When Mr. Thompson told us the new owner wanted quality meals, we stayed up half the night planning a proper breakfast. Around the dining room, I could see the other residents having similar reactions. Mrs. Dorothy was actually eating everything on her plate instead of pushing food around. Mr. Peterson was asking for seconds. Mrs. Garcia was humming while she ate. This is what happens, I thought to myself, when you prioritize people over profits. After breakfast, Mr. Thompson found me in the lobby reading area. Mrs. Hartwell, I hate to bother you, but we have a situation developing. Your son Robert is in the parking lot with what appears to be a television news crew. I looked up from my book. A news crew? Channel 7 News. They're setting up cameras and interviewing Robert about something. I thought you should know. I walked to the lobby windows, and sure enough, there was Robert in his best suit, standing in front of a news van with Channel 7 Investigates painted on the side. A reporter with perfectly styled hair was holding a microphone while a cameraman filmed. How interesting, I murmured. He's trying to play this in the media. Mr. Thompson looked worried. Should I call security? Ask them to leave? No, I said thoughtfully. Let's see what story Robert is trying to tell. In fact, let's invite them inside. Mrs. Hartwell, are you sure that's wise? I smiled at him. Mr. Thompson, I've learned that the best way to deal with lies is with truth, and I have nothing to hide. Within 20 minutes. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chen, was sitting across from me in the facility's conference room. Her cameraman was setting up equipment while she reviewed her notes. Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for agreeing to speak with us. Your son Robert has made some very serious allegations about your recent business transaction. I'm sure he has. What exactly is Robert claiming? Jessica consulted her notes. He says that you've been manipulated by unscrupulous individuals into purchasing this nursing home, that you're not mentally capable of making such a large financial decision, and that your family is being denied access to ensure their protection of your interests. I nodded calmly. And what would you like to know from me? Well, first, can you tell me about your decision to purchase Sunset Manor? For the next 30 minutes, I told my story. I explained how my children had forced me into the facility against my will, how they had threatened me with guardianship proceedings, how they had already begun selling my house without my consent. I showed Jessica the legal documents proving my competence and the legitimacy of the purchase. So you're saying your children had you committed here so they could take control of your assets? Jessica asked, her reporter instincts clearly engaged. That's exactly what I'm saying, and I have documentation to prove it. I produced the letters Robert had sent to various lawyers, the real estate listing for my house that had been posted before I was even moved to the facility, and the threatening voicemails they had left when I first resisted their plan. Jessica's eyes widened as she reviewed the evidence. This wasn't the story of a confused elderly woman being taken advantage of. This was a story of family betrayal and an elderly woman fighting back. Mrs. Hartwell, your son claims that purchasing a nursing home is not the kind of decision a resident would normally make. How do you respond to suggestions that you're not thinking clearly? I laughed. Jessica, I successfully negotiated and completed a multi-million-dollar business acquisition in less than a month. I had legal representation, financial advisors, and I met all regulatory requirements. If that's not thinking clearly, I don't know what is. And the decision to ban your children from visiting? Would you want to spend time with people who had stolen your home, threatened your freedom, and treated you like a burden to be disposed of? The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Jessica asking increasingly pointed questions about my children's behavior and my response. By the end, it was clear that the story she was going to tell was very different from the one Robert had pitched. After the news crew left, I called Margaret to update her on the situation. A news interview? She said, sounding concerned. Eleanor, are you sure that was wise? Margaret, my children chose to make this public when they brought in a news crew. I'm simply making sure the truth gets told alongside their lies. What if this backfires? What if it makes them more determined to fight you? I thought about that. Then they'll learn that I'm more determined to fight back than they ever imagined. That afternoon brought more visitors, but these were visitors I was happy to see. Sarah Chen arrived with another lawyer, a man named David Park, who specialized in family law. "Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah said, "we need to discuss your legal position. Your children have retained a law firm, and they're exploring several options to challenge your actions." David opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "They're considering 3 main approaches. First, they want to challenge your mental competency and seek guardianship. Second, they want to claim that your purchase of the facility was made under duress or undue influence. Third, they're exploring whether they can claim you're being held here against your will." I listened to their concerns, but I wasn't worried. "And what are our responses to these approaches?" "For the competency challenge," Sarah explained, "your successful completion of the business acquisition actually works in our favor. It's very difficult to argue that someone who can negotiate a complex commercial transaction is mentally incompetent." David nodded. "For the undue influence claim, we have documentation showing that you initiated the purchase idea yourself, that you had independent legal counsel, and that you made the decision freely. The fact that you researched the facility's financial situation on your own shows clear intent and planning." "And the claim that I'm being held against my will?" "That one is the easiest to refute," Sarah said with a smile. "You own the building. You can leave any time you want. You're choosing to stay here, which is your right as both owner and resident." We spent another hour going over potential legal strategies and responses. By the time they left, I felt confident that my children's legal challenges would fail. But I also knew that Robert, Patricia, and Linda weren't going to give up easily. That evening, the Channel 7 news story aired. I watched it in the community room with several other residents, all of us gathered around the television like we were watching a movie. The story opened with footage of Robert in the parking lot, looking serious and concerned as he explained his elderly mother's situation. But then it cut to my interview, where I calmly and clearly explained what had really happened. "This isn't a story about an elderly woman being taken advantage of," Jessica Chen said in her closing commentary. "This is a story about family dynamics, financial manipulation, and one woman's remarkable response to being written off by her own children." The residents in the community room actually applauded when the story ended. Mrs. Dorothy patted my hand and said, "Good for you, Eleanor. It's about time someone showed these ungrateful children that we're not just old furniture to be moved around." But the real satisfaction came an hour later, when my phone rang. It was Margaret. "Eleanor, you need to turn on Channel 7 again. They're running a follow-up story." I turned the channel back to the news, where Jessica Chen was standing outside my old house on Maple Street, the house my children had already put up for sale. "Tonight at 6, Jessica was saying, "we brought you the story of Eleanor Hartwell, who purchased the nursing home where her children had placed her against her will. Now we've learned that Mrs. Pam, Hartwell's children, had already listed her house for sale before she was even moved to the facility, lending credence to her claims that this was about money, not care." The camera panned across my beautiful front yard, showing the "for sale" sign that I hadn't seen since being forced to leave. The realtor they had chosen, probably Robert's golf buddy, was declining to comment on camera. "The asking price," Jessica continued, "is $850,000. According to property records, the house has been in Mrs. Hartwell's name for 45 years. Her children claim they were forced to sell it to pay for her nursing home care. But Mrs. Hartwell's purchase of the entire facility suggests that financial resources were not the issue her children claimed." The story concluded with a statement from Robert's law firm saying they had no comment on pending legal matters, but maintained that their clients had acted in their mother's best interests. By the time the second news story ended, my phone was ringing constantly. Margaret called to say that 3 different lawyers had contacted her, offering to represent me pro bono if I wanted to sue my children for elder abuse. A social worker from the state called to ask if I needed assistance or wanted to file a complaint. And most surprisingly, a literary agent called to ask if I was interested in writing a book about my experience. But the call that meant the most came at 9 o'clock that evening. It was from Emma, Linda's teenage daughter, my granddaughter who I hadn't spoken to since being placed in the facility. "Grandma Eleanor?" Her voice was small and uncertain. "Emma, sweetheart, is that you? I saw the news story. I didn't know what Mom and Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia did to you. I'm so sorry." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt tears in my eyes. "Oh, Emma, you don't need to apologize for your mother's choices." "But I do. I should have visited you. I should have asked questions when they said you had to go to the nursing home. I believed them when they said it was for your own good." "Emma, you're 17 years old. It wasn't your responsibility to question the adults in your life." "But I'm old enough to know right from wrong, and what they did was wrong." We talked for 20 minutes, and Emma told me about school, her boyfriend, her plans for college. Normal grandmother-granddaughter conversation that I had missed desperately. "Grandma," she said before hanging up, "can I come visit you sometime? I know Mom said you don't want to see the family, but Emma, you're always welcome here. You had nothing to do with what your mother and aunts and uncle did to me. Mom's going to be really mad if she finds out I called you. Then don't tell her. This can be between you and me." After Emma hung up, I sat in my room feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at my children for what they had done. Satisfaction at how effectively I had turned the tables on them. Sadness at the family relationships that had been damaged, perhaps beyond repair. But also hope. Hope that not all family connections were lost, and that there might be people worth saving from this mess. The next morning brought another surprise. I was having breakfast when Mr. Thompson approached my table with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Hartwell, you have visitors. They're not on the restricted list, but, well, perhaps you should see who it is." Curious, I followed him to the lobby where I found 2 people I hadn't expected to see. My sister Helen, who lived in California, and who I hadn't spoken to in over a year, and my nephew Jason, Helen's son, who was a lawyer in San Francisco. "Eleanor," Helen said, rushing forward to hug me. "I saw the news story. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me what Robert and the girls were doing to you?" I hugged my sister back, feeling overwhelmed by the first genuinely loving embrace I'd had in months. "Helen, I was so humiliated. I didn't want anyone to know how badly I had misjudged my own children." Jason stepped forward, his expression serious. "Aunt Eleanor, what they did to you was unconscionable. Helen and I flew out here as soon as we saw the news. We want to help." "Help how?" Helen took my hands in hers. "We want to make sure you're protected. Jason thinks you should consider filing criminal charges for elder abuse. And we want to make sure Robert, Patricia, and Linda face consequences for what they've done to you." I looked at my sister and nephew, people who had dropped everything and flown across the country to support me, and I realized something important. I wasn't alone in this fight. My children had underestimated not just me, but the entire network of people who actually cared about my well-being. "Let's sit down," I said. "We have a lot to discuss." As we settled into the lobby chairs, I noticed Mr. Thompson hovering nearby with an expression of barely concealed excitement. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I hate to interrupt, but I thought you should know there's another news crew in the parking lot. And this time, it's not just local news. That's a CNN van." I looked out the window to see a much larger media presence than yesterday. Multiple news vans, reporters, and what appeared to be a small crowd of onlookers. Helen followed my gaze and whistled softly. "Eleanor, I think your story is going national." "Well," I said, straightening my shoulders, "then I suppose it's time to make sure the whole country knows what happens when you underestimate a determined woman." As if summoned by my words, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Robert. "Mom, we need to talk. This has gone too far. Please call me." I showed the message to Helen and Jason, who both shook their heads. "Too little, too late," Helen said firmly. "Much too late," I agreed, deleting the message without responding. Outside, I could see more cars pulling into the parking lot. The story was spreading, and people were taking notice. My children had wanted to control the narrative, but they had lost control of everything else, and this was just the beginning. The CNN interview changed everything. By the time reporter Anderson Cooper finished his segment about the nursing home heiress, as they were calling me, my story had spread across social media like wildfire. Justice for Eleanor was trending on Twitter, and videos of my interview were being shared millions of times. But the real shock came 3 days later, when I received a phone call that would change not just my life, but the lives of elderly people across the country. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Senator Patricia Williams from the Senate Committee on Aging. I've been following your story, and I'd like to invite you to testify before Congress about elder abuse and the need for stronger protections for elderly Americans." I nearly dropped the phone. "You want me to testify before Congress? Your case has highlighted systematic problems in how we treat our elderly citizens. Your courage in fighting back has inspired thousands of people to come forward with their own stories of family manipulation and institutional abuse." Helen, who was still visiting from California, was sitting beside me when I took the call. When I hung up, she was staring at me with her mouth open. "Eleanor, do you realize what this means? You're not just getting revenge on Robert, Patricia, and Linda anymore. You're changing the system." She was right. Over the past week, I had received hundreds of letters and emails from elderly people, sharing their own stories of being forced into care facilities, having their assets stolen by family members, or being isolated from loved ones. My personal battle had somehow become a symbol of something much larger. The morning of my congressional testimony, I woke up in my room at Sunset Manor feeling nervous but determined. I had chosen to stay at the facility even though I could now afford to live anywhere I wanted. This place had become my home, and more importantly, it had become a symbol of what elderly care could be when it was done with dignity and respect. The improvements we had made over the past month were remarkable. The food was now restaurant quality, prepared by a chef I had hired from a 5-star hotel. We had added art therapy, music programs, and a garden where residents could grow their own vegetables. The staff was happier too. The raises I had given them had improved morale dramatically, and we now had a waiting list of qualified people wanting to work here. But the most important change was less tangible. The residents had hope again. They felt valued, respected, and cared for. Mrs. Dorothy had started painting again for the first time in years. Mr. Peterson was teaching a weekly class on woodworking. Mrs. Garcia had organized a Spanish conversation group that was attracting participants from the broader community. As I prepared for my trip to Washington, I thought about how different my life was now compared to 6 months ago. Then I had been a victim, powerless, isolated, and written off by the people who were supposed to love me most. Now I was about to address the United States Congress about one of the most important issues facing our aging society. The hearing room was packed with reporters, family members of elderly abuse victims, and advocates for senior rights. As I took my seat at the witness table, I looked out at the audience and saw familiar faces: Helen and Jason, Margaret, Sarah Chen, and even Emma, who had driven down from college to support me. But I also saw three faces I hadn't expected. Robert, Patricia, and Linda were sitting in the back row, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Senator Williams called the hearing to order and introduced me to the committee. Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for coming here today to share your experience. Your story has captured the attention of the nation and highlighted critical issues in elder care and family dynamics. For the next hour, I told my story to the senators and the watching television cameras. I explained how my children had manipulated and threatened me, how they had forced me into institutional care against my will, and how the system had failed to protect my rights as an elderly person. The assumption, I said, looking directly at the camera, is that when you reach a certain age, you lose the right to make decisions about your own life. Family members, lawyers, and even well-meaning social workers begin treating you like a child who can't be trusted with important choices. But age doesn't automatically equal incompetence. And family relationships don't automatically equal good intentions. Senator Williams leaned forward. Mrs. Hartwell, what would you say to other elderly Americans who might be facing similar situations with their families? I would say that you have rights and you have power, even when it doesn't feel like it. Don't let anyone convince you that you're helpless just because you're old. Research your options, seek legal advice, and remember that sometimes the people who claim to know what's best for you are actually the people who know what's best for themselves. The questioning continued for another 30 minutes, with senators asking about needed legal reforms, better oversight of care facilities, and stronger protections for elderly assets. Finally, Senator Williams asked, Mrs. Hartwell, some people might say that what you did, buying the nursing home to get revenge on your children, was extreme. How do you respond to that? I smiled. Senator Williams, I didn't buy Sunset Manor for revenge. I bought it for justice. Revenge would have been using my resources to hurt my children. Justice was using my resources to ensure that elderly people receive the care and respect they deserve. When the hearing ended, I was surrounded by reporters asking for interviews and advocates wanting to discuss partnerships with Sunset Manor. But the moment that mattered most came when I walked out of the hearing room and found Emma waiting for me. Grandma, she said, tears in her eyes, I'm so proud of you. You've changed everything. Emma, sweetheart, I hope I've changed things for the better. You have. Did you know that 3 different universities have started elder rights programs because of your story? And there's a foundation being started in your name to help elderly people fight family abuse? I hadn't known about any of that, but it filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. As we walked toward the exit, I noticed Robert, Patricia, and Linda approaching. They looked older than they had just a month ago, worn down by the legal battles, media attention, and public criticism they had faced. Robert stepped forward first. Mom, can we talk, please? I looked at my 3 children, people I had once loved without reservation, and felt not anger anymore, but sadness. Sadness for the family we could have been, for the relationships that had been destroyed by greed and selfishness. You can talk, I said quietly. I'll listen. Patricia spoke first, her voice shaky. Mom, we're sorry. We made mistakes and we hurt you and we're sorry. We thought we were doing the right thing, Linda added. We were worried about you living alone, and we thought the nursing home would be safer. I held up my hand to stop them. Linda, please don't insult my intelligence. You weren't worried about my safety. You were worried about your inheritance. Robert cleared his throat. You're right. We were thinking about the money, but Mom, we're still your children. We still love you. Do you? I asked. Because love isn't about control, Robert. Love isn't about taking away someone's choices because those choices are inconvenient for you. Love isn't about threatening someone with legal action to force them to comply with your wishes. We know that now, Patricia said desperately. We've learned from this. We want to make things right." I looked at each of them carefully, trying to see if there was genuine remorse or just regret that their plan had backfired so spectacularly. "Making things right," I said slowly, "would require you to understand not just that what you did was wrong, but why it was wrong. It would require you to see me as a person with rights and dignity, not as an obstacle to your financial plans." "We do see that now," Robert insisted. "Mom, please. We want to be a family again." Emma stepped closer to me, slipping her hand into mine. "Grandma, you don't have to decide anything right now." She was right. This conversation was too important to rush, and I was too emotionally drained from the hearing to make major decisions about family relationships. "I need time to think," I told my children. "I need to see if your apologies are backed up by actions, not just words." It was Robert who surprised me by nodding. "That's fair. We know we have a lot to prove." 6 months later, I was back in my room at Sunset Manor, but everything had changed again. The facility was now part of a network of elder care centers that prioritized dignity and quality of life over profit margins. The Eleanor Hartwell Foundation for Elder Rights was providing legal assistance to hundreds of elderly people facing family manipulation. And I had written a book about my experience that was helping families have difficult but necessary conversations about aging and care. My relationship with my children was complicated. Robert had resigned from his law firm and was now working pro bono for elderly rights cases. Patricia had started volunteering at a senior center and was pursuing a degree in social work. Linda was in therapy and had joined Gamblers Anonymous. They visited regularly now, real visits, not 15-minute obligation checks. We talked about what had happened, why it had happened, and how to prevent it from happening to other families. It was slow, careful work, rebuilding trust that had been shattered. But the relationship I treasured most was with Emma, who had changed her major to elder law and was planning to work with the foundation after graduation. She visited every weekend, bringing energy and hope to the facility. "Grandma," she said during one of our walks through the garden, "do you ever regret buying this place? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just accepted what Mom and Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia wanted?" I thought about her question as we paused beside the rose bushes I had planted in the spring. "Emma, I think I would have died here, not physically, but emotionally and spiritually. They wanted me to disappear quietly, to become invisible, to stop being Eleanor Hartwell and just become elderly mother who needs to be managed. And now? Now I'm more Eleanor Hartwell than I've ever been. I have purpose, I have power, and I have the satisfaction of knowing that other people are being helped because I refuse to be invisible." That evening, as I prepared for bed in my room at Sunset Manor, the room I now chose to live in rather than being forced to accept, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. My children had tried to write the ending to my story, assuming I was too old and weak to write it myself. They had been wrong about so many things, wrong about my mental capacity, wrong about my financial resources, wrong about my willingness to fight back. But most importantly, they had been wrong about what happens when you underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Robert. "Mom, thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for showing us who we had become and for giving us the chance to become better people. I love you." I smiled as I typed back, "I love you too, son. But next time you want to put me in a nursing home, remember that I might just buy the place." The next morning brought news that filled me with pride. The Eleanor Hartwell Act had passed both houses of Congress, establishing new protections for elderly Americans against family financial abuse and mandatory waiting periods before family members could have elderly relatives committed to care facilities. Senator Williams called to congratulate me. Mrs. Hartwell, you've changed the lives of millions of elderly Americans. How does it feel to know that your personal battle became a national movement? I thought about all the letters I still received from elderly people who had found the courage to stand up for themselves, about the families who were having honest conversations about aging and care because of my story, about the care facilities across the country that were improving their standards. Senator Williams, I said, it feels like the best revenge is living well, fighting back, and making sure no one else has to go through what I went through. That afternoon, I had lunch in our beautiful dining room with Mrs. Dorothy, Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Garcia, and a dozen other residents who had become my chosen family. We talked about our plans for the fall festival, the new art studio we were opening, and the book club that was reading my memoir. Eleanor, Mrs. Dorothy said as we finished our meal, I have to ask, do you ever miss your old life? Living in your house? Being independent? I looked around the table at these wonderful people who had welcomed me, supported me, and celebrated with me. I thought about the staff members who had become friends, the residents who had found new purpose and joy, the family relationships that were slowly healing. Dorothy, I said, I thought my life was over when my children forced me here. I thought this was where people came to wait to die, but it turns out this is where I came to truly live. As we left the dining room, I passed the framed newspaper article hanging in the lobby, the first story about my purchase of Sunset Manor. The headline read, Local woman buys nursing home after children place her there against her will. But underneath it was a newer article with a headline that made me smile every time I saw it. The Eleanor Hartwell Act, a new era of protection for America's elderly. My children had tried to silence me, to make me invisible, to reduce me to a problem that needed to be managed. Instead, they had given me the greatest gift of my life, the motivation to discover just how powerful one determined woman could be. And as I walked back to my room in the facility I now owned, surrounded by people who respected and cared for me, I realized that sometimes the best chapters of your life are the ones you never saw coming. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.